Good evening. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral, and welcome to the forum. Tonight, we are choosing, every year we choose a theme, and our theme for the cathedral this year is the Year of Bridges. It turned out to be a theme that's really important for us, especially as we're in coronavirus shelter in place. Building bridges, connecting to people who are different from us, reaching out to others is especially important during these days. And for this whole year, we've talked a lot about how to form connections with people who are different from us. How can we reach out across the divides that separate us? While racism is very much on our minds right now, another serious divide between us is religion. Grace Cathedral hosts what we may think is the largest regularly meeting yoga practice in the world. We have hundreds of people, 600 or 700 people gathering weekly when we're actually gathering. And there are estimates that over 20 million people in the United States practice yoga. But what do we really know about the religion that gave us this practice? What is Hinduism, one of the world's oldest major religions that is practiced by over 1 billion people? Tonight, we're trying to get Wendy Doniger to join us. She's one of the foremost scholars on Hinduism. She has doctorates in Sanskrit and Indian Studies from Harvard and Oxford. She is Professor Emerita of the University of Chicago and a prolific author, translator, and editor. She's published almost 30 books in as many years. Her groundbreaking work, The Hindus, an Alternative History, elucidates the relationship between recorded history and imaginary worlds, the inner life and the social history of Hindus. And I'm going to begin by reading a little bit from the back of the dust cover. It gives a sense for what the book is about. An engrossing and definitive narrative account of history and myth, The Hindus offers a new way of understanding one of the world's oldest major religions. Hinduism does not lend itself easily to a strictly chronological account. Many of its central texts cannot be reliably dated within a century. Its central tenets arrive at particular moments in Indian history and often differ according to gender or caste. And the differences between groups of Hindus far outnumber their commonalities. Yet the greatness of Hinduism lies precisely in many of these idiosyncratic qualities that continue to inspire debate today. This groundbreaking work elucidates the relationship between recorded history and imaginary worlds, the inner life and the social history of Hindus. So this week we are talking about Wendy Doniger's book, The Hindus, an Alternative History. It's this book right here. And one of the first questions I have for you is, you have made a lifelong study of South Asian religions, and you've studied social conflict and probably racism and xenophobia. And with all the things that are happening across the country right now, I wonder how all that scholarly experience kind of informs your sense for what's happening right now.
Well, there's a great deal in Hinduism about the end of the world. That's one thing that came to mind immediately.
That's true.
The first thing that anyone who's ever studied Hinduism would say right now is that it is the Kali Yuga. It is the end of time when all the worst aspects of human beings are magnified, their virtues vanish, the gods become really angry, and everything's about to go up in smoke. So that's the Kali Yuga is characterized by the failure of human beings to be good people.
Oh, there you go. Thank you so much. Well, so yeah, you're talking about the end times, and I wonder, Christians and Jews may be more familiar with just the apocalyptic accounts that we've inherited. Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about, how
it's not an apocalypse in the sense that suddenly things go wrong and the gods intervene and wipe you out. The Greeks had that, the Jews and Christians had that. No, in India, it's an inevitable decay in the nature of things. When the world begins in the Golden Age, there are 4 ages. In the Golden Age, people are good and kind. They live a very long time, and everybody's just fine. It's like, in a way, it's like the myth of Eden, really. Everything.
And they live 100 years long, right?
They live hundreds and hundreds of years, indeed. Everything is wonderful. But unlike Eden, where there's a serpent in some versions and and a satanic intervention in another that spoils the garden, things simply wind down through time. People can't go on being good. They get tired of being good. They start lying, they start stealing, they start committing adultery, they start killing people. And so the golden age goes into a third age, and then a second age, that is to say the fourth, the age of the four is the good age. We decline to 3 to 2, and when there's only 1/4 of goodness left, that's now.
Ah, right.
And it just happens. It happens because people can't go on being good. They get tired of it. Sometimes they get bored, sometimes whatever it is. And there we are now. And there's nothing we can do about it. In some versions of the myth, it's like the myth of Noah's Ark. Some people survive, good people gather together in a cave. And when it's all over, the world goes up in fire, the world goes up in flood, they come out of the cave and they find other people coming out of other caves. And I love this line. They say to each other, "My dear, how good it is to see you still alive."
Oh, that's so perfect with all of us in our own caves right
We
now.
come out of the cave and you see you're not the only one that survived. And then we begin again. Those are good people. So they don't lie. So they don't kill. So they don't commit
Right.
adultery.
And
And the
then the
world,
cycle begins
and they get
again.
tired of exactly. So it's
So,
not that the gods intervene. It's that we ourselves can't hang on. We have it. We have it. And we just loosen our grip and we slide down in it. But it will start over again. That's the good news.
right, right, exactly. I love that story. And, you know, one of the things that was so powerful about your book for me was there were so many stories like it in there. And,
They're
and
the
I
best
want,
stories.
oh, I know, they're so powerful. You know, I think maybe I've been reworking through the creation narratives and Genesis and Noah, and maybe I've overdone it on those, and I need to start reading some other people's stories. But
But
maybe
you
you can
certainly
talk
need to read
about.
these stories. These are the best stories in the
Oh,
world.
they're so great. They're so. That's what I think I get from your book too, is how much you appreciate these stories.
Oh, I love them. I keep finding new ones. I've been doing this for 50, 60 years. I keep finding stories. I didn't know that story. I didn't know that. There's lots and lots of it. You know, it's been
Yeah.
going on since about 2000 BCE. So that's
Right.
a long
Right.
time to tell. So it's an unbroken tradition.
Yeah. So
So
maybe you can give us kind of like the introduction to the South Asian religions, Hinduism. I love that you started with 50,000 years.
yes.
You know, the first 2 chapters, I really, that helps me to situate everything, to have, you know,
Yeah.
that big of a perspective. But I'd love it if you could just give us kind of an introduction, a summary of just what constitutes this religious world.
Well, since it's gone on for such a long time, it's gotten very complicated, because one of the things that's characteristic of Hinduism, and unlike some other religions, is that when somebody has a new idea that differs from the old idea, they don't throw out the old idea, they build onto it. In a way, it's like the New Testament building on the Hebrew Bible. You don't say, well, now we have the New Testament, we're not going to read Genesis. You say, no, 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 we still have the Proverbs and so forth. So it's rather like that, in the sense that the Vedic books, which are these 1500 BCE books, are really very different from what comes, but they're still there. So you have the Vedas, you have animal sacrifice, you have all sorts of things. Then you
Yeah.
stop doing animal sacrifice, and there's a lot of non-injury and the idea of not of animal life as well as human life being sacred. But some people still go on doing animal sacrifices.
Right.
So
Right.
then you have the people, you have this new stage where you have non-injury, and then you have new gods coming up, some of whom are very fierce and who demand other kinds of sacrifice. So it's layered and layered and rich and rich. And the idea that there is a single form of Hinduism is a very silly idea that never really came to India until a bunch of Protestants called the British took over for a couple of hundred years and said, so what is your Bible? What is it that everybody in India believes? And
Right.
some guy in Calcutta said, oh, we have the Bhagavad Gita. And the British said, aha, so that's the Bible. And the Hindus, a lot of them believed it too. So there are a lot of Hindus who think there's only one kind of Hinduism. It's in the Bhagavad Gita. That's all there is. But not only scholars of India, but other forms of people in India, people all over India have many, many different holy books that tell
Yeah.
many different sorts of stories.
What,
And a
what
lot of
brings
them
them
are
all
aware.
together? What brings them all together? Like, what makes it like a category? Do you know what I mean? Just
A lot of people think it's not a category. A lot of
Right,
people think
exactly. I guess that's
the
right.
word Hindu is meaningless.
Yeah.
I'm not one of them. I understand that point of view. But if you have people in India who are Buddhists, and if you have people in India who are Jains, which are
Yeah.
religions that begin in India, and you have people in India who are Muslims, a religion that does not begin in India, but that has millions and millions of adherents. And indeed, you have people in India who are Christians. The people who aren't those things are, I think, the Hindus.
Right, right. That's good. I
So it's
love it.
sort of it's a kind of a default position in many ways, but there are also a lot of things that all these Hindus do have in common. It's not the Bhagavad Gita, but it's another set of ideas, such as the idea of karma.
Right, right.
All Hindus share that, where some Muslims and some Taoists and some Zen Buddhists would not share it. It's the idea that everything you do piles up a record into your body and your soul, and when you die, you take it with you into rebirth. Hindus believe that. By and large, all Hindus believe in that.
Yeah.
So there is a core of beliefs. There's not a holy book that they share, but they're ideas that they have. They all know about the Kali Yuga. These
Right,
people that I want to
right.
call Hindus and have been called Hindus. It's an awkward word because it was given originally by the Persians. It really means the people who live in the land of the
Oh,
Indus River.
Indus River, yes.
And so it's not their own. Well, there's a lot of problems with calling them Hindus, but there's been no other word offered that works.
So when you were a child, was it clear that this is the path that you were on to study this, or how did you become the person that we recognize as you today?
Oh, I loved it. But first I heard my mother gave me, I wrote a book about my mother and her role in my life
Oh,
last year. My mother was very interested in other countries. My mother never finished high school, but she was a highly educated woman. And she knew about India. She knew about Angkor Wat. She knew about a lot of things. And she gave me a copy of Umar Garden's books about India. And she gave me a copy of A
ah,
Passage to India. And
oh,
eventually
right.
I read the Upanishads in what I now realize was a terrible translation, but nevertheless, it's what we had then. So right in high school, I was always interested in religion, and I was always interested in ancient languages. So I knew Greek. I learned a little bit of Greek in high school, and I loved the idea of Sanskrit, that it had funny letters that were different from the letters of the
Yes,
English
yes.
alphabet. So through high school, I already knew that I wanted to study ancient India. When I was 17, and I went to Radcliffe, I studied Sanskrit. So
Yeah.
I knew what I wanted as a teenager. I was fascinated. And I loved everything about India. I loved the bright colors. I loved the food. I love that you could eat with your hands. I've
Uh,
always loved that. I never liked knives and forks. To this day, I'm really not good with knives and forks. So I love the earthiness. I love the bright colors on their paintings. I love their music, that the music didn't go bump, 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 but it went,
yes.
that it slid up and down. It seemed messy, and rather than the formalness of Christianity and Western stuff, it seemed that you could slide back and forth. I loved the stories.
Yeah,
I loved the
yeah.
sculpture, all the hands on the gods, and everything. It was not simple. It was not, well, you had just a picture of Mary and Jesus. Instead, in Hinduism, you had all these gods with heads and hands, and
I
it
love
seemed
that.
multiple. Everything was multiple about it. I loved it.
Yeah, rich. Like, yeah, I love that. I had a friend of mine who was a theosophist and came to divinity school to study Sanskrit. And
Uh,
it kind of defeated him. He just wasn't able to master it. You know what I mean? I think it was just a huge disappointment for him at the time. But
theosophy is not really Hindu at all. It's the opposite
I
of
know. It's
Hinduism.
so, but
It's a shame.
he had his heart in it. But tell me a little bit about the language. Like, it's a highly inflected language. What makes it such a difficult language? And, what are some of
Not
the
a
joys?
difficult language when you learn it. I always wonder how little tiny Chinese children can learn Chinese. It
Good
seems to me
point. They're
like a
great at
really
it too.
difficult thing. They just think it's that. So it's like any other language. It's a little harder to learn in the beginning. It has 56 letters, and it has many more cases. Every noun has single, plural, and dual. And instead of 5 cases, it has 8 cases. And you have to learn a lot. You have to memorize a lot of stuff in the beginning.
Yeah.
But after that, it's just a language. It's just a wonderful language. It has compounds. Um, It's really easy. The kind of Sanskrit that I'm not a very good Sanskritist, actually. There are many different kinds of Sanskrit, and the kind that I read is like Koine Greek.
Oh yeah, right.
Greek, my Greek teacher at Harvard used to say that if Paul had taken his Greek class, he would have flunked him. It's the
I'm
New
glad. Paul's hard to read. I agree with you.
New Testament Greek is so much easier than, Plato or something like that. So the kind of Sanskrit I read, which is storytelling Sanskrit, has its own vocabulary and its own forms. And after a while, you read it like English.
Yeah, yeah. What were some of the teachers who influenced you? And what did the field look like when you first started? It must have been just a really different landscape, the kinds of scholarly questions that people were asking. Like, what was it like in that world?
Well, the teachers that influenced me, of course, if you ask any good scholar, they'll always tell you about their high school teachers.
Oh,
Those
that's
are the ones
good.
that really
That's true.
matter.
Yeah.
Miss Lilienthal, Anita Lilienthal, she was young. She was straight out of teachers college. She must have been 23 or 24. She was my Latin teacher. And she knew I loved Latin and she knew I loved India. And she said, well, I bet you'd really love Sanskrit. And I said, what's Sanskrit? So
Wow.
that's where that began.
Lovely.
But then my teacher at Harvard was the great Daniel Ingalls, who was great historian of Sanskrit and Sanskrit literature. And he didn't like women. He didn't really like Jews. He didn't really like Black people.
Yeah.
And his family ran the Homestead Hotel in Virginia, which was anti-Semitic. And so he came from a very bad background from the standpoint of liberal. But although I was a girl and Jewish, he kept saying, it's a waste of time educating women because they just get married and have children. He nevertheless did educate me.
Yeah.
And I graduated summa cum laude because he recommended me for a summa. So
wow.
he did nourish me in every way. And so he was an enormous influence on me. And the things that I learned from him stayed with me forever. So I had good teachers all along the way, but I was the only woman in the field for a long time.
Oh, I can imagine that. How was that? I mean, what was that like?
In many ways, it was fun, I must say. I liked being a woman and I liked working with men. And I accepted Berkeley, where I was treated very badly for 3 years, except for that brief period. I was when I taught in London, there were some male scholars who, when I entered the senior common room, would put down their paper and walk out.
Ah, that's terrible.
But then there were people who didn't. They hired me, so there I was. So I really felt that I got along with most of the men in the departments in which I was the only woman. I was the only woman in this and that and that.
Yeah.
But I was mostly with men who thought it was rather nice to have a woman in the department. And so I didn't suffer the way a lot of women suffered in my time. When I came to Chicago in 1978, I was on the Committee on Social Thought, and I was in the Department of South Asian Languages, and I was in the Divinity School. I had a triple appointment, and I was the only woman in each one of them.
Wow.
And so Chicago announced that they'd appointed 3 women, one in South Asia, one in...
Oh, that's called killing 3 birds with 1 stone,
Absolutely.
I guess. I don't know what they call it.
Yeah. But I was mostly treated well in all those places.
I love that. I mean, so much of the book too. I do think that being a woman, really made the book a lot richer. Do you know what I mean? I just think there's a way in which your eyes are open to things that that maybe my eyes wouldn't be open to.
Well, one thing was I could talk to women.
Right, exactly. Completely.
So you get all these books by these male anthropologists, and they tell you what everyone feels about everything, and you realize they've never interviewed a single woman, because in India, a woman would not be allowed to talk to them.
Right, exactly. So how did that just change your field? I mean, because you were the one who was speaking, and you did have this unique perspective, and you were able to talk to women. How did that change, how the world looked to people studying South Asian languages?
Well, first of all, other women joined. I didn't stay the only woman for long. I stayed the only woman in the South Asia department for like 25 years. They were very slow to appoint other women. Yeah. But I was not the only woman in the divinity school. They appointed other women soon after, and I had women colleagues. But I also was able to get away with a lot because I was not only a woman, I was a rather flamboyant woman. So I wasn't a woman in a three-piece suit.
Right.
I didn't play that game. I
Yeah.
didn't try to sneak in and pretend I was a boy. So everybody knew I was a girl. And that allowed me to ask questions and talk about human things in ways that sometimes the men felt that it was beneath their dignity to do. So you could talk about sex.
Sex. Yeah. There's a
You
lot of
could
sex in
talk
your
about,
book.
there's a lot of sex in the world, you know.
Exactly. Completely.
Um, so you could talk about that. Also, women students came to me, and indeed also men students would come to me with personal problems that they felt they couldn't bring to the male professors.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So I had really, especially in the early years when I was only 5 or 6 years older than some of my students. A lot of my students retired before I did. I would be able to find out things about them and help them in ways which were a little more personal than the ways that my male colleagues had. And that enriched my life. And I had some wonderful, brilliant students that I could really participate in the lives of in ways that I think a lot of my male colleagues felt it was beneath their dignity to do. So doors were open to me as a woman. I didn't notice doors shut to me. I know there were doors shut. But a lot of doors were also open,
Yeah.
and that was a great privilege.
You know, one of the things about Grace Cathedral that you may not know, but we have like 600 or 700 people practicing yoga every Tuesday night. Well, before the COVID-19 started, and it's an interesting scene. You know, a clergy person from the cathedral staff will like give a short little talk, and then people practice yoga in this massive Gothic cathedral. And I remember reading and studying a little bit more about the kind of the scholarly approach to yoga. And I wonder if you have anything to say just about yoga in America, and you know, in what ways does it understand Hinduism, and what ways is it not understand it, and you know, what are the family resemblances?
Well, that's a complicated question. Yoga in India begins in the centuries before the Common Era, and it's a meditation system. And it's about concentration. It's about, the word yoga is connected with our word yoke, like
Yoke,
you'd
right?
yoke two oxen together. And also junction is also related to the same word. It means joining things together, and it means the way you'd harness up oxen, the way you'd harness something, you harness up your mental forces in yoga, and you concentrate in certain ways. It has nothing to do with the training of the body.
Yeah, yeah.
Patanjali's Yoga Sutras have only one thing to say about the body, and it is sit in a comfortable way. That's it.
Right.
So the idea that yoga is a way of training the body in order to train the mind comes largely from Swedes in the late 19th
Yeah,
century.
like the German health movement.
German health movements, and then it was picked up eventually by Iyengar in India. So it gets some Indian input in the late 19th, early. It does finally have some Indian input.
It's one of those things. I mean, California is part of that story, like turn of the century health consciousness, turn of last century. So, you know, 1905 health consciousness in California is part of that story. It's almost like Californians kind of getting something of their own back to themselves again.
It's really true. It comes back like a pizza effect. It comes back to California. There's more California than India in American yoga to this day.
Yeah.
So sometimes I get very snobbish about people quoting Sanskrit mantras when they're doing downward dog or something like that. So on the one hand, it has really nothing to do with India. My other great teacher in Chicago is Mircea Eliade.
Oh yeah, of course.
Great book, which he
Yeah.
published in 1958. The English translation was published in 1958, the year I went to Radcliffe, was Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom.
Right.
One of the best books ever written about India. And it's about the meditation tradition. It's not about downward dog.
Yeah, yeah.
So on the one hand, yoga has nothing to do with India. On the other hand, it's a wonderful system of relaxation and people's bodies. It's, you know, Iyengar was a very interesting man. So it's a modern Indian tradition borrowed from the Swedes. And then there's a coating of Indian meditation on the top of it, like icing on a cake in a way. So it's a very funny, bastardized tradition, but it's done a lot of people a lot of good. So
Yeah.
it's a good thing.
Exactly, and it's just in a way all religions are, I mean, are like that, right? They get
They're a
something
mix.
from, yeah. I mean, that was something I think so. I've been thinking about so much. I've been dying to ask you about just what is in the Jewish and the Christian traditions that I mean, obviously people have written papers about the influence of South Asia on those traditions. Is there anything to say of it, or is it just so far back that we can't really talk about that line of connection?
Interesting. Good question. Hinduism began much earlier than Christianity and Judaism,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
1500. On the other hand, the Christians have been around for a while and the Jews for a while longer. And there's been contact between India and the rest of the world right from the start. There's there's evidence of a knowledge of the Hebrew Bible in the Indus Valley civilization, 2000 BCE. So India is not isolated. People managed to get across those Himalayas. They had boats that sailed to South India in centuries and centuries before the Common Era. So there is contact between India. We have in the Hebrew Bible the idea of peacocks and Solomon and so forth. They knew about India. So the world was already all joined together in the ancient times. And there are ideas, in particular, the last avatar of Krishna is Kalki, who comes riding on a white horse. And he comes to, it's the Kali Yuga, it's this terrible age we're in now.
Yeah.
And one of the characteristics of the Kali Yuga is that India is overcome by barbarians. So what it really is this horror of immigrants, which we now experience in such a shameful way.
Yeah.
That's the Kali Yuga too. They've overrun, these foreigners are overrunning us. That's a sentiment that's expressed in ancient India as a characteristic of the Kali age, because foreigners came into India all the time. It was, they pillar, the wonderful things came from India, ivory and gold and all this sort of thing. So the rider on the white horse comes into India to free India from the barbarians. But the rider on the white horse is a Christian apocalyptic image.
Yes,
And it
exactly.
comes into India from Christianity. So Christianity gives India the image that they use to express their desire to get the Christians out of India.
Oh, that's so great. I love to hear that.
That is how mythology works. You take what you
Exactly.
find and you use it in any way you want.
Well, exactly. And that's why, we're so offended when Donald Trump walks across the Lafayette Park and stands in front of St. John's, and everybody's trying to use these religious symbols in their own way, and they're very powerful.
How that game is played. That's how that game is played.
Yeah, it is definitely how that game is played. Have you ever heard of Eknath Easwaran? He was an English professor who lived in California and did translations of the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah. There are other examples of how we see Indian culture in America. And I wonder if you have anything to say about those two. I mean, Diana Eck is doing that Pluralism project that's showing how many immigrants we have who are Hindus. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about both those kinds of phenomena.
Well, I think the real India came into America really in the end of the 19th century, began with the Chicago World's Fair, really, the World Parliament of Religions,
yeah.
Vivekananda, and then Annie Besant, and so forth. Yeah. So a certain brand, you've been asking very good questions. So you got me to talking about how broad Hinduism is and how there's no single thing. Well, one tiny little part of Hinduism got into America in 1897, whenever the World's Fair was in Chicago. And that is a particular brand of Upanishadic philosophy redone in India, in Calcutta in the late 19th century to make it as much like Unitarianism as possible.
Interesting.
It's usually, it's a brand of modern Hinduism. It's called Reform Hinduism sometimes, or Bengal Reform. And it is influenced by the presence of the British, and in particular by Unitarianism. And it picks out from Hinduism certain things which are acceptable to a Western audience. It was designed to do so. So we don't have anybody slitting the throats of goats, which is a perfectly natural way to be a Hindu. We don't do that.
In America.
We don't do that. We don't do that. We meditate And we talk about the union of the soul with the world soul, which is also a part of Hinduism. So there's a selection of a particularly mild and philosophical brand of Hinduism. You've got before that, you have the New England
Right.
transcendentalists who love the Upanishads and so forth. So
They
there's a
did.
kind of India, of a little piece of Hinduism that has always been very attractive to Europeans. Germans all loved it too. Nietzsche and so forth. So you have that kind of Hinduism gets into America.
Yeah, it's just, I guess, the way that missionary work happens everywhere. That, like Yale Divinity School was larger than life in bringing Christianity to Hawaii, and so a lot of like ways Hawaiians look at religion and Christianity in particular was more influenced by that kind of Christianity than other forms.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's that piece of Hinduism which got into America in various forms, starting with Annie Besant and so forth, and going on with Eknath and so forth. You had some of the gurus coming in the 50s and 60s into California.
Right.
And
Right.
that was also really part of that same kind of Hinduism, the meditation, the unity of the soul with the soul of God, the individual soul. Most of that really is in the Upanishads, which are a wonderful philosophical text written in about 600 BCE, and still a big part of a lot of Hinduism. That's of the thousands of books that were composed in Sanskrit. That's one of the ones that had the greatest staying power. And it's a beautiful book too. It's a wonderful book. So that piece of Hinduism is really what got into America. That and the Krishna Bhakti part, the Hare Krishna people in the airports and all of that.
Right. Exactly.
That's another piece of Hinduism that got in, which
Yeah.
is different from the Upanishads, which is the love of God who loves you. It's a very easy and simple and attractive part of Hinduism. And the mythology of the child Krishna is very sweet. It's like the worship of the Christ child. It has a natural appeal. So those pieces of Hinduism have been very successful in America.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because you're right. We recognize all those as being part of our world. One of the things that you write about is just vegetarianism and what that means in Hinduism. And I wonder, how do you describe just kind of the kind of history of that idea through South Asian religion?
Well, that's also a point of argument, I must say. The idea that no Hindus have ever eaten meat and that no Hindus do eat meat is simply not true. Some Hindus don't eat meat. But just as I'm saying, there's all different kinds of Hindus, the sacrifice of goats, the sacrifice of chickens, as we speak, somewhere in India, someone is killing a goat and or a chicken. So animal sacrifice and the eating of meat has remained a very important part of a great deal of Hinduism. A lot of Hindus do that. They sacrifice animals and they eat meat. Some Hindus do not. That really is not, that didn't begin as much with Hinduism. It began in the 6th century or so BC, the so-called Axial Age, when Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism were all taking a new form in India at that time. And Jains really do not ever kill animals, and they do not eat meat. Real serious Jains wear a mask so that they won't accidentally inhale an ant, and they have a brush that they brush the path as they walk on, lest they accidentally step on an insect. Those are serious vegetarians. A lot of Buddhists are also vegetarians, although some are not. There's something in India called Buddhist eggs, which is that the Buddhists are allowed in some parts of Buddhism to eat an egg that hasn't been fertilized, but they can't eat an egg that might have a live chick in it. So when butchers see a Buddhist coming, they reach under the, I can't do this on the screen, they reach under the counter and they break the shell of the egg so that the Buddhist can buy it. So even in Buddhism, there's a little bit of finagling, but some Hindus at the same time as the rise of Buddhism, Jainism, that 6th century BC, some Hindus became serious about not taking the life of animals and also not taking the lives of humans, which is something that most Hindus have never believed in. There's always been a lot of killing in ancient India and right straight through. But there are some Hindus who didn't who believe that you shouldn't kill anybody, including your friends and relatives, and including Muslims and other people, and
Yeah.
including animals. And that is the part of that 19th century branch of Unitarianized Hinduism
Right.
that has been spread as Hinduism, and that the present government of India, Modi's government, is saying is all that Hindus have always believed and that all Hindus believe. And they're using it, of course, to kill the Muslims who still provide the meat that many Hindus eat.
Right. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I mean, that's one of the things too. I mean, even in the book you mentioned having somebody throwing an egg at you, just, and maybe you could talk a little bit about just like your kind of your controversial side, like what makes you a controversial person? You know, why do people have problems with you and your work?
Yep. Well, I'm controversial because I've written a great deal about the other forms of Hinduism, other than that Unitarian Hinduism, which Vivekananda brought to America.
Yeah.
So people who want to believe that that is all there is to Hinduism are angry with me when I say, look here, look at these other texts, and look what there is, and look what other Hindus believe. So the idea that Hinduism is a unitary religion, just like Unitarianism, and that all Hindus are very much like a certain type of Christian, that they're vegetarian and so forth. So I have been fighting against that idea all my life. I've been saying, look at these stories, and look how good they are.
Right.
It's not like, the early Christian missionaries, oh, you're all barbarians, you sacrifice goats, why don't you become Christians and stop doing it? I'm not doing that. I'm saying this religion is so much more interesting than anything Vivekananda ever said.
Yeah.
Look how wonderful Hinduism is. And look, when you look at the ancient texts, look how much there is about women, about the defense of women. It's not just, widows burning themselves on their dead husband's funeral pyres, which is the notorious form of Hinduism that the British made fun of. But there are texts saying women are smarter than men, women shouldn't be pushed around, widows have a right to remarry and so forth. Look how they object in ancient texts to the treatment of the lower castes. Look how liberal so many. So here I am saying how wonderful Hinduism is, how much more interesting it is, and how much more humanly liberal it is. And they say, oh, you hate Hindus, you hate Hinduism, and so forth. So
it's funny. I mean, just in just the American context, I mean, the people who get most angry are the people who say Christianity is this one way, and I agree. It's just I think a large part of our work as human beings is to remind people that just of the diversity of the experience and expressions of Christians, of Hindus, and so I can imagine how angry people get, just based on how angry people get at me for saying that.
And then again, you're not a woman.
Yeah, exactly.
So
and I'm also, I'm in the community, speaking about the community, and there's that element too, where you can, someone can say, well, you're an outsider, and so you don't know anything, or.
So I'm a woman. I'm not a Hindu. And I talk about things, I call it like it is. I talk in a very vernacular way. My books are easy to read. People do read them. They're successful. There's just a whole lot of things that make those who want to preserve the image of Hinduism as a tiny, straightforward, very respectable, rather colorless religion. They don't like all the nonsense. For years, when it was still friendly, I would give a long lecture in a big lecture hall, and then there'd be Q&A. And invariably, in those days, people were still very polite, the good old days. An elderly Indian gentleman would get up, and instead of asking a question, he would give an alternative lecture so that the people in the auditorium would know from an Indian man what it really was like.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine that.
And I would give my right arm to have that man in the audience now, rather than the people that I have to deal with now.
Yeah,
he was always polite. He had his own point of view. It was a wee bit sexist, but it was respectful. And then you have the whole question of cultural appropriation.
Oh, yes, totally.
Which, I retired 2 years ago. I'm going to be 80 in November.
Oh, my goodness.
And I thought I got out just in time.
Yeah.
I was lucky to have the long run that I had, because the idea that only a person who's raised within a religion has a right to talk about it.
I,
Would not only put me out of a job, but it would destroy the humanities. The whole point of the humanities is to get into somebody else's head. And the idea that only women can talk about women and only Jews can talk about Judaism, which is something also I've been fighting in academically all my career, and that only people from inside a religion, that only Black people can talk for Black people. That idea is so destructive of the real humanity of the study of religion and the study of comparative religion, which is my particular field,
yeah.
that I don't know where the field will go now, how we will ever learn to get along with one another when women won't let men into classes on feminism and so forth. It's not just Hinduism, it's part of the whole bracketing off of the world, which we're fighting so hard against. Among all the terrible things that have happened this week, there were some good things, and it was wonderful to see white people and Black people together in these demonstrations. It's not just us against them.
Yeah.
And I wish that there was more of that in the academic study of religion too.
Yeah, Dermot McCulloch wrote like a book like yours size on the history of Christianity, and I really appreciated having a non-Christian perspective on Christian history. You could be a bad historian and non-Christian, and you can be a good historian and non-Christian, and I think he has.
No, I'm not trying to replace Hindus. I mean, this conversation, you have Hindus who know things I could not possibly know, and I've always said so, and I've always used their work and quoted their work. Ultimately, you want the insider's view, but there are things that the insider does not know about her own religion.
Exactly.
And you want those as well. You don't want them instead, you want them as well.
Yeah. Diana Eck always said, if you know only one religion, you don't really understand religion.
That's right.
And she was a good teacher. I have so one of our traditions on our show is that we take questions from the audience. And so our first question is, if you could recommend a Bollywood film, what would you recommend? Do you know anything about that genre? Do you have any film recommendations?
Yes, there's a wonderful film called Amar Akbar Anthony. Amar Akbar Anthony. Those are the names of a Hindu, Muslim, and Christian boy who grew up together as children in India, and all the things that happened to them. It's a wonderful, it's a delightful movie. One of my students wrote a whole book about it. It's a famous and rightly famous movie. And it's a wonderful movie about these three religions and how different they are and what a friendship between them is like. It's a great movie. That's the one I would recommend.
Oh, that's perfect. I'm so glad. And now we can get things like that, and we're watching a lot of things like that.
It's a famous one. You also get the book about them too. It's also nice. But see the movie.
What do you think is the most important thing for a non-scholar to know about Hinduism?
To know that you'll never understand all of it because it's so enormous.
Yeah, well, that's what amazed me. You talked about like the number of verses in the Vedas, and compared to like how big the Bible is, for instance. And you're right. It's impossible to get your arms around it. It's just
you can never know about it, and because it has vegetarians and people who sacrifice goats. You have to realize it's not one thing. You have to learn about 150 different basic things that it is. It's a philosophy, it's a religion, it has funny stories, it has sad stories, it has bigots, it has liberals, so that there's no one single thing about Hinduism. You have to acknowledge that whatever you know, it'll only be a little tiny piece of what you could know if you could live 1,000 years.
So another question is, are you following the political situation in India right now? And could you comment?
Yeah. It's very much like the political situation in America right now, where the man in charge is not the man you would want to have in charge.
Yeah.
Where there's a terrible need for somebody with wisdom to deal with the crisis, and what you have is someone with a very narrow view. Narendra Modi has a very, very narrow view of what India is and what Hinduism is, and he enforces it. in a very powerful way. It's not an accident that he and Mr. Trump are friends. They're joined, among other things, by their shared hatred of Muslims, but they're also joined by a lack of understanding of what I can only call diversity.
Yeah.
And therefore things in India are going very badly because, first of all, things in the planet Earth are going very badly, and there's a lot of poverty and there's a lot of suffering, as there is in America. So it's a matter of scale there. So they too have a problem with health. They have a problem with inequality. They have a problem with religious violence between not so much black and white, but in their case between Hindus and Muslims. And the man in charge is doing nothing to prevent any of those bad things happening. On the contrary, he is fanning the flames.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a very familiar picture. You know what we have? We have some photographs and images that we got, and I'd love to have Rebecca put them up, and maybe you can talk a little bit about them. We don't have very much more time, but I wanted to have something to like give us a sense of that like manifoldness, the multiplicity that you were describing.
Yes.
So Rebecca, if you put up the images, that would be great, and then we can see what
yes. I can see that. That's right. Okay, so that's an image from the book I just sent to the publisher now about the history of horses in India. And it's about how Indians love horses, even though their horses always come from outside, in particular brought by the Muslims, and how the presence of the Muslims in India changed the whole culture of horses. For the ancient Indians only liked stallions, but the Muslims rode mares. And so in the Middle Ages, you get in India stories about wonderful mares that you never had. There's all macho stuff in the ancient Vedic text. Stallion, stallion, stallion. And all of a sudden, these mares come. So this is an image of a man on a horse trampling another man under his feet. Right. So it begins with the idea that horses are foreign, that they're dangerous, that they're big, that only rich people have them, and they're destroying us. And so that's the negative image you really ought to have of horses. And yet Indians, Hindus have loved horses. Even when they never saw a real horse, they told stories about horses. They drew pictures of horses all over India. You see lovely images of horses. So the book is about how Indians came to love this foreign animal and to love the culture that brought it in. It's in a way, it's a tale of the assimilation of a foreign religion in a very positive way, even though you begin with images like this. And you have throughout Indian history statements that a man wants to die where he can't hear the hoofsteps of Muslim horses and so forth. Very anti-Muslim statements like this one. And yet you overcome it with these beautiful pictures of horses and stories of horses weeping because they love the owner so much. And so
I love the hearing that you worked on this on the project about the horses and your mother's book. What projects do you have coming up next? What are you thinking about in terms of your scholarship and study?
Well, the horse book has to get through the press, so we're going to argue with the copy editors and all that sort of thing. Won't come out for another year. But what I'm working on now is the translation of the last books of the great epic of the Mahabharata, which is all about dying and going to heaven and hell. So it's really a story about eschatology, about different ideas. People throughout the book wonder what happens to people when they die. And some people say, well, you go to heaven. Some people say, no, you go to hell. Some people say you're reborn. So in the context of a story, it's the end of the great epic. After the war is over, there are these books at the end of the Mahabharata, all about the different possibilities of what might happen to you when you die. And it's never been really translated well before. And that's my project now. I'm doing it for Oxford University Press.
Oh, great. I'm so glad. Here's another image that
this is a horse sacrifice. Here's so much of vegetarianism. Right. So they're taking apart the horse and they're washing the different parts of the horse. And so these are Brahmins preparing the stallion. This is a stallion. This is early India. This is a Vedic sacrifice. And these are all Brahmins chopping up the horse in various ways.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is a Buddhist image of a horse-headed demoness who is considered very beautiful and very sexy, even though she has a horse head. And she carries off, she's like a siren, she carries off Buddhist sailors to a fate worse than death. And so that's the Buddhist text. The Buddhists have two kinds of horses. They have the horse that the Buddha rode when he became enlightened. The horse carried him away and then wept for him. And then there is the female horses. So the good stallion and the evil mare, the female horses that carry away sailors, seduce them, and then ultimately eat them. These are the beautiful horses in South India. This is a photograph. My book has lots of pictures in it. I have an art historian, Anna Seastrand, who got these. She took this. They're often 50 feet high. They're made of clay. They're fired in a pit for 3 months and so forth. And they're stationed around temples in South India. And then in the night, the gods ride them all around the villages to protect them. So this is the worship. This is Hindus worshiping horses. The same Hindus that experienced horses in history in a very negative way, being trampled on by foreigners. And yet the villagers who never had horses, who can't afford horses, they love them because they're beautiful and wonderful. And they make these fabulous images of them and put them all around their villages.
Oh, I think that's like the perfect image. When you first started and talked about what you love about that world, this image just seems for me to just be the perfect example of that. You know, I've had a chance to hear you speak at Harvard Divinity School and at American Academy of Religion, and I was looking forward to this so much, to seeing you and to hearing what you had to say about your work. But our time has run out. It just seems like the blink of an eye. But now these are the other horse images too.
Yeah, these are
it's been such a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It was very thoughtful, and it was really helpful, I think, for us to get a picture of a different world for right now. So thank you so much.
It was a great pleasure. It's always nice to be asked about your work, and I enjoyed you asked good questions too. You gave me a chance to say things I wanted to say, so I'm grateful to you.
I'm glad. Well, I've enjoyed your book so much. It's just been such a pleasure to read it. So for all of our visitors, next week, our guest will be Herman Waitchen, professor from San Francisco Theological Seminary and the Graduate Theological Union, whose focus is exploring the Gospels for their revolutionary insight. You can help us to bring the arts to life at Grace with a gift to the forum. Please join us at gracecathedral.org/give to Grace. And again, thank you so much, Wendy, for your generosity of spirit and for your lifetime of work on these really important questions. We're so grateful to you.
It was all pleasure, I can assure you.
Thank you and take care.